Right, hello BTEC group. This is Unit 3. This is Theories of Persuasion, C1. And in this particular video we're going to look at the Hovland Yale theory and also at the research that's been linked to it. So, the Hovland Yale model was designed by someone called Carl Hovland. This is just background information. You don't need to necessarily remember any of this. But what he looked at was, how do you persuade people to sign up to help in wartime and get them to change their behaviour in wartime to support the war. So he took, once the war had finished, he carried on his research and came up with this model, which we now apply to advertising. And behavioural change in general. If you think about health, we want to persuade people to be more healthy and change their behaviour in various ways, like stopping smoking. So that's what this applies to. So the first step, and he focuses on who says what to whom. So it's got 3 parts: source, message and audience. And when you look at the source, so who's delivering or communicating the message, what person is involved, there's basically 2 choices. You can use experts or non-experts. Experts tend to be more persuasive, but that can also include someone, not necessarily like a doctor, but it could be someone who has personal experience of something. So like a drug addict saying don't take drugs, for example. Even though they're not a doctor with all the medical knowledge, we take them to be an expert because they've had that experience. Then the second part is the message. That's what's being communicated, and so in that you're looking at, are we using a 2-sided or a 1-sided argument, and different people are persuaded by differently by those. So someone who's more intelligent might be more persuaded by a 2-sided argument but find a 1-sided argument patronising. And the other thing to do with the message is the fear factor. So you've got those adverts which are really make you feel terrified. So think about a smoking advert that's really graphic, you're gonna die and there's gonna be all this stuff's gonna happen. That only works, they found, if you also provide an easy way to deal with it. So don't just make people terrified, but also give them simple steps to follow to change their behaviour. So if you couple those 2 things together, he found it was really effective. And then to whom? Audience factors. So we he looked at things like the level of intelligence of the audience and how that interacted with the message that was being given. So for example, the 2-sided versus 1-sided argument. Also self-esteem. So he found that the most effective way of persuading people was if they had a lower intelligence, they were easier to persuade, or if they had a low self-esteem, they were easy to persuade compared to high intelligence, high self-esteem. So that's what he found about how best to persuade people. Use experts as the source, or people with experience. Consider how your message and your audience interact. Should you use 2-sided or 1-sided argument? Use fear, but also give hope to people. Okay, so let's have a look at the strengths and weaknesses of this model. We've got evidence to support it, first of all. So there was a study by some people called Sturges and Rogers, and they presented young people with information about the dangers of smoking, and they did it in various different ways. So they had a low threat message, which gave low hope, high threat combined with high hope, and all the different combinations. And they found that the most persuasive was the high threat and also high hope. So that supports Carl Hovland's idea of the message needing to have fear but also hope to be effective in persuading it. The second thing that supports this is Hovland and Weiss, which we'll look at in a second. Weaknesses of the model. First of all, there's contradictory evidence. So Baumeister and Covington found that people with high self-esteem were easier to persuade than people with low self-esteem. So that directly contradicts the audience part of the model. The other thing is that actually Maguire found that it wasn't a straightforward link with persuasion and self-esteem. So this is again about the audience, because what the model said, if you remember, was that low self-esteem meant you were easier to persuade than high self-esteem. But what he actually found was that your self-esteem was for low self-esteem you were okay to persuade, but that you were not very persuadable with moderate self-esteem, but that you were persuadable with high self-esteem. So he found that it wasn't as straightforward a link, that his research was contradicting the idea that the low self-esteem people were easiest to persuade. And then what we have next, this is our key study in this within this topic, and it's again Carl Hovland basically carrying out research to support his theory, but this is what he found. So they gave articles to students where they were reading about things at the time, this is ages ago, obviously 1951, these were like really controversial topics. So if it was carried out today, it would be probably stuff like Brexit and coronavirus, but at the time that was like antihistamine drugs, steel shortage, atomic submarines, the future of movie theatres. So they read some articles on these topics. The first group had a highly respected academic journal, which was highly credible. So we're thinking about like having an expert if we think about our source. Group 2 had like a tabloid newspaper equivalent. It wasn't The Sun, but it was something similar from the time in America. So low credibility. So what we're looking at then is that participants changed their minds significantly more often with high credibility sources. So that finding supports the Hovland Yale model of persuasion, because it's saying that if there's an expert, then they're more likely to persuade you. However, what it also found was that this effect decreased over time. There was an initial effect that then reduced. And then if you look at the people who were reading The Sun, they found that actually they didn't persuade them at first, but over time they had changed their mind to fit with the article and had been persuaded. And that's part of what we call the sleeper effect, where what you have is people read something persuasive and think, oh no, I don't really agree with that, partly because they're reading it in like the Sun newspaper or the Daily Mail or something, but then over time they forget where that initial idea came from, and then it ends up persuading them because they actually do agree with the idea. So if we think about this study, then you've got those with the expert were persuaded but the effect decreased. Those with the non-expert were not persuaded but then over time they were. So it contradicts the Hovland Yale model, because what it's saying is that it doesn't really make any difference in the long term. It might make an immediate difference, but over time, whether you have a high credibility source or a low credibility source, i.e. an expert or not an expert in the source, it doesn't make any difference. They ended up the same. Okay? Right, if we evaluate that particular study, because it's your key study, so you could be asked to explain criticisms or strengths of it. So first of all, it's got practical applications. If you need a short-term change, then you use a credible source, you use an expert, and then you're more likely to get a quick short-term change. If you need a long-term change, perhaps think about focusing on like the message or the audience a bit more in making your message a bit more persuasive. And then in terms of weaknesses, your sample were students from Yale University, so they're American, they're a particular age range. We don't know, and also they're quite academic probably, so we can't necessarily generalize to the average person. Yeah, they were also like they were there to read the articles. They were a captive audience. In everyday life, if you think about like campaigns and adverts and stuff, you only have half an eye on them, don't you? That's going to be different. You're not like giving them your full attention. So therefore, actually, we may not be able to generalize to real life from that setting in the lab. Right, so that is the Hovland-Yale model with Hovland and Weiss's key study. So make sure you make some really detailed notes on all of that.